This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. We're coming up on 32 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. It's aimed at prohibiting discrimination and giving people with disabilities the same opportunities as everyone else. However, most of the country is still not built for people with disabilities in mind, especially our streets and sidewalks. This also comes at a time when pedestrian deaths are at an all-time high. A recent analysis from the Governor's Highway Safety Administration found that in 2021, nearly 7,500 pedestrians were killed, the largest number in 4 decades. A Georgetown study shows that pedestrian wheelchair users are over 30% more likely to be killed in crashes than non-wheelchair users. Nearly half of these deaths happened at intersections. In many of those cases, drivers weren't yielding to pedestrian right-of-way, but design at intersections plays a role too. Yochai Eisenberg and a team of researchers at the University of Illinois at Chicago conducted a study that shows just how much our sidewalk and street infrastructure is failing when it comes to making cities accessible and safe for people with disabilities. Through their research, they found that on average, 65% of curb ramps and 48% of sidewalks across the country are not accessible.
So you'll be driving along or walking along and you'll see a very accessible curb ramp that will not be connected to any sidewalks. Or you'll see a nice sidewalk that ends abruptly. And so that lack of connectivity and lack of, what I could try to describe as intentional planning, right? Like really thoughtful planning is not there.
The team at the University of Illinois at Chicago discovered this gap by evaluating ADA transition plans. Under the ADA, states and local governments are required to have a transition plan in place for how they're going to reduce physical barriers for people with disabilities. But not all of them do, and no one's really checking. Out of over 400 government entities the team looked at, only 13% had ADA plans readily available, and only 7 of them met the minimum criteria required. Some of those requirements include things like getting public feedback, coming up with a plan for making things more accessible, and a schedule for making it happen. In their research, they noted that many communities don't understand enough about these transition plans and lack data on how much of their pedestrian infrastructure is inaccessible.
So some communities definitely did, and they developed a whole plan and followed through. But the issue is many of them didn't continue with it. And obviously in those 30 years, many communities have expanded, right? And not all of them have followed a lot of the guidelines for accessible design. And so as a result, there's this need to continue on with it. And what, the Federal Highway Administration, the Department of Transportation at the federal level likes to talk about it as it's a living document. It's not supposed to be something that you do once and then forget about.
Eisenberg says cities like Tempe, Arizona are a good model to turn to. They've set a goal of addressing barriers to accessibility by 2030 and have created a map showing where the plan will roll out and what ramps and sidewalks will be replaced. The city has also been active in getting public participation, and that feedback has been a huge help. One of the only ways governments are currently being held accountable for having accessible infrastructure is through lawsuits, and experts say this should not be considered the main strategy for developing accessible communities. The Department of Justice created Project Civic Access to conduct reviews of ADA compliance. Since they started in 1999, they've reached over 200 settlements in all 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. These reviews took place because the DOJ wanted to visit every state, and in response, the cities agreed to make improvements.
Cities have done a lot, not that cities have not done anything. Cities have, continually worked to upgrade their infrastructure, but, it kind of connects well with the way that many cities and federal and state funding in transportation has gone to roads and highways, right? That's predominantly what the budget for that infrastructure goes to, and very little for sidewalks and bike lanes.
Looking at how we can do a better job going forward, disability rights advocates say that some funding from the $1.2 trillion federal infrastructure bill, which includes $11 billion for transportation safety programs, should be spent on curb ramps, sidewalks, and roads designed to slow traffic to make crossing streets safer. The bill does include the first ever Safe Streets and Roads for All program to reduce traffic fatalities like pedestrian deaths we mentioned earlier.
What I like to come back to is this a pedestrian network where people with disabilities feel safe walking and wheeling in their communities? We're not at that point yet. And I think that's the point at which we want the outcome that the ADA was intending for.
When talking about these issues, it's important to hear from someone who has experienced the difficulty of navigating inaccessible cities firsthand.
So I am a low vision non-driver. I have an eye condition, neurological condition called nystagmus that makes my eyes wiggle all the time, and it just means that I don't see detail, I don't see fast moving objects very well, and so I can't drive. But I still do have, a fair amount of vision, sort of on the spectrum of blindness.
Anna Zevarts works on mobility initiatives for Disability Rights Washington, a statewide advocacy group based in Seattle.
So we have a network of non-drivers, around 200 folks from around the state that we've collected stories from that are advocates with us and trying to fight for better transit service. And a big part here is just that lack of connectivity from where people live to the nearest transit stop.
While these groups help bring attention to a lot of the accessibility issues cities have, part of the struggle is competing with other infrastructure projects for grants, whether that money is coming from the infrastructure bill or any other available funding.
If you go in and say we're gonna put ramps in 13 different intersections, the way things are set up is it isn't seen as a competitive project because they're each individual projects instead of sort of one whole one, if that makes any sense. And so they're just when competing against other infrastructure improvement needs, we see that the ADA stuff just doesn't win out.
As primary elections are taking place in states across the country, another barrier for people with disabilities is access to voting rights. These barriers have always existed. Circling back to some of the issues we hit on a bit earlier, some polling places are designed without ramps necessary for people to enter, and that's just to get into the place. Oftentimes, they face additional barriers inside the polling location. Now, there is another option that allows some people to avoid having to go in at all: absentee ballots. The thing is, it's getting harder to do that in some places. Last year, 19 states passed laws that restrict voter access. That's the most we've seen in a decade, and a lot of them specifically targeted absentee ballots. Wisconsin is one of those states. National correspondent Usher Qureshi has more on the impact some voting restrictions there are having on people with disabilities.
When he was just 2 years old, Bill Crowley sustained a spinal cord injury in a car crash. But being a quadriplegic never stopped him from using his voice.
I vote pretty much every election that there is, both, the bigger national ones and just down to local races.
He needs the assistance of family, friends, or caregivers to actually put his absentee ballot in the mailbox.
Due to my spinal cord injury and quadriplegia, I'm unable to physically do that myself.
Trudy LeBeau votes the same way.
I don't cast a ballot without assistance.
Diagnosed with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, she can no longer move her arms or legs.
Hey Siri. If I show up at the polls,
open Facebook.
A poll worker has to be with me and fill out the ballot and insert it into the machine for me.
Following the 2020 elections, a conservative legal group challenged the use of absentee ballot drop boxes in Wisconsin and the legality of having someone other than the voter mail or return their ballot for them. In January, a Waukesha County judge ruled in their favor.
In the Tigan case, would not allow a voter to have anyone other than the voter themselves mail or deliver their ballot. Well, that's a big problem for a lot of people with disabilities.
The case has now made its way up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, but disability rights groups have also filed suit, insisting that restricting absentee voting conflicts with federal protections for voters with disabilities.
We believe that the rights of people with disabilities to have assistance from a person of their choice with return of their ballot are protected by federal law.
There's nowhere in Wisconsin law you're going to find a prohibition against returning your friend's absentee ballot or placing your own ballot into a drop box. It does not exist.
Scott Thompson with the nonprofit Law Forward is representing Disability Rights Wisconsin, the League of Women Voters, and Wisconsin Faith Voices in their intervening lawsuit.
Voters with disabilities have an incredibly broad set of protections in federal law that allows them to vote. And sometimes it's in different mechanisms.
Go back.
Trudy LeBeau says without assistance, she'd literally have to deliver her ballot with her teeth or lose her right to vote.
I agree that our elections need to be as secure as possible, but not to the point of taking the voice away from people.
Bill Crowley says he will do whatever it takes, but fears others may not.
Because I'm determined to make my vote and voice heard. But I know for many people that this added barrier would, in many cases, prevent them from voting at all.
A decision from the state Supreme Court could come as early as this week. Reporting from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I'm Usher Qureshi.